On a cold night in Newport News, Virginia in 1982, a quiet neighborhood was about to become the center of one of the most disturbing forensic failures in American history. It happened in the middle of the night, the kind of hour when the world is silent, the streets are empty, and people sleep believing they're safe behind locked doors. But safety on that night was shattered. This is the story of a man who spent 33 years in a cage because someone claimed his teeth matched a bruise. The story of a system that refused to listen. The story of freedom stolen and freedom returned. The story of Keith Allen Harward, the sailor who lost half his life to a lie and survived to tell the world how easily it could happen again. On September 14, 1982, an intruder dressed in a white Navy uniform with dog tags around his neck broke into the home of Jesse and Teresa Perrone. He beat Jesse to death with a crowbar as he lay in bed. Then, for several hours, he repeatedly raped Teresa while their children slept in a nearby room. Teresa later explained that one of the most challenging aspects of the ordeal was trying to stay quiet to protect her kids. The attacker threatened to rape her daughter if she didn't comply. During the attack, the assailant bit Teresa's legs from her ankle to her thighs. The intruder vanished into the darkness before police could respond, leaving behind only chaos, trauma, and a single clue that would later ruin an innocent man's life. A bite mark. That's all it took. Because the attacker wore a sailor's uniform, the investigation focused on sailors aboard the USS Carl Vinson, a recently commissioned aircraft carrier dry-docked near the victim's home at the Newport News shipyard where Jesse worked as a welder. Dentists aboard the ship ran visual screens of the dental records and teeth of between 1,000 and 3,000 officers. A young Navy sailor named Keith Allen Harward, just 26 years old, was among those screened. Though his dentition was initially highlighted for additional screening, a forensic odontologist later excluded Harward as the source of the bites. The case went cold for 6 months, but then something happened that would seal Harward's fate. In March 1983, Harward's then-girlfriend, Gladys Bates, reported to police that he had bitten her during a dispute. He became a suspect 6 months after the crime, not because of new evidence but because of this unrelated domestic incident. The Commonwealth resubmitted wax impressions and dental molds of Harward's dentition to 2 ABFO board-certified forensic dentists, Dr. Lowell Levine and Dr. Alvin Kadji. Both concluded that Harward was the source of bite marks on Teresa Perrone. Dr. Levine was known as one of the foremost experts in forensic bite mark analysis and had served as president of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. Although the naval and local dentists who conducted the initial screenings had excluded Harward as the source of the bites, in the wake of the ABFO experts' identifications, they both changed their opinions. Suddenly everyone agreed. Harward's defense attorney sought opinions from 2 additional forensic dentists before trial, but those experts also concluded that Harward inflicted the bites. In total, 6 forensic dentists falsely identified Harward. The evidence against him was paper-thin. Teresa Perrone was never able to identify Harward as her attacker, either before or at trial. Harward didn't match the physical description she gave police. He didn't know the victim. No physical evidence linked him to the crime scene. But there was more evidence pointing away from him, evidence the jury never heard. A Virginia Department of Forensic Science employee suppressed critical serological evidence. Blood typing tests that excluded Harward as the source of body fluids found on the victim following the crime. At the second trial, the prosecution argued that Harward could not be excluded as a source of blood evidence recovered at the crime scene, but the Innocence Project later learned that the blood evidence actually proved Harward's blood type did not match. And there was something else the defense never knew. Police investigators withheld critical information. Both Teresa Perrone and the Newport News shipyard security guard who claimed to have seen Harward entering the shipyard with a bloody uniform had been placed under hypnosis. Certain key components of their testimonies changed after hypnosis. The security guard's identification occurred only after the witness was placed under hypnosis, a practice now known to be highly unreliable. Because defense counsel wasn't informed of the hypnosis, they couldn't object to the admission of these hypnotically enhanced recollections. Despite testifying in his own defense, despite presenting evidence he didn't match the victim's description, Harward sat stunned as the experts, dismantled his life in front of a jury. Their testimony was treated like gospel, and in that courtroom their words weighed more than evidence, more than logic, more than truth. Harward was convicted of capital murder but was spared the death penalty by the jury. His conviction was reversed in 1985 because of an issue regarding how the capital murder statute should be interpreted. In 1985, the Virginia Supreme Court ruled that he couldn't be convicted for capital murder in the commission of a rape because the murder victim and the rape victim were separate people. He was retried and convicted again in 1986 of first-degree murder, rape, forcible sodomy, and robbery, and sentenced to life in prison. He was initially sentenced to 65 years. At the second trial, he was no longer eligible for the death penalty under Virginia law. As the courtroom emptied, as reporters scribbled notes, as officers led him away in chains, Keith Harward looked back one last time. Not at the jury, not at the judge, but at his mother, who sat frozen, tears streaming down her face, realizing her son had been swallowed by a system that didn't know truth from illusion. Inside prison, years passed like slow-motion punishment. Every morning the same routine. Every night the same cell. The world outside moved on. Presidents changed. Technology evolved. New generations were born and grew up. But Harward remained trapped, aging, fading, waiting for a justice system that had already forgotten his name. Harward was given a life sentence and said he was just waiting to die. He lived with and accepted the knowledge that he was going to die in prison, worthless and of no help to others. As DNA technology advanced, Harward begged courts to test the evidence. Again and again the system refused. Final verdict, they said. Case closed. The bite mark dentists remained respected, their careers built on testimonies like the one that put him away. Meanwhile, Keith watched other inmates go home, watched them reunite with families, watched them step into sunlight he hadn't touched in decades. He watched everything except freedom. But then, quietly, slowly, something began shifting. Harward had written to the Innocence Project looking for help in 2006. In 2014, Chris Fabricant, director of strategic litigation for the Innocence Project, noted that his paralegal came across Harward's case while specifically looking for bite mark conviction cases to work on. They studied the file. They examined the bite mark testimony. They found contradictions everywhere. Those 1 in a million claims? Scientifically impossible. Bite mark identification? Completely unreliable. False. Discredited. Junk science. Innocence Project attorney Olga Axelrod later reflected that the evidence against Keith was incredibly weak. In fact, there was physical evidence known at the time that pointed away from Keith. But the exculpatory evidence was rationalized away because the expert dentist said he was the guy. In 2015, the Innocence Project obtained a court order for DNA testing of physical evidence. They performed DNA testing on the rape kit and numerous other pieces of crime scene evidence. The results changed everything. The DNA testing excluded Harward and identified Jerry Crotty as the person responsible for committing the crime. Crotty was another sailor stationed on the same carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, at the time of the crime. Crotty, who looked similar to Harward, was in and out of prison for most of his life until he died in an Ohio prison in 2006 while serving time for abduction. The truth was undeniable. The Commonwealth of Virginia had imprisoned an innocent man for 33 years while the real killer lived freely, committing more crimes, until he died behind bars for completely different offenses. On March 4, 2016, lawyers from the Innocence Project and from Skadden, ARPs, Slate, Marr and Flom LLP filed a petition for a writ of actual innocence with the Supreme Court of Virginia. Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring filed a response recommending that the writ of actual innocence be granted as quickly as possible. Herring stated that based on careful examination of the circumstances including the latest DNA testing, it was clear that Keith Harward was innocent. Herring said no rational trier of fact would have found proof of Harward's guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. On April 7, 2016, the Supreme Court of Virginia granted Keith Harward's writ of actual innocence, formally exonerating him of all the crimes for which he had been convicted. This was the fifth writ of actual innocence granted by Virginia's top court based on new biological evidence. When officials came to deliver the news, Keith didn't understand at first. After so many broken promises and denied appeals, freedom felt like a cruel joke. But when the words finally settled, "You are cleared," he broke down. For the first time in decades, the weight began to lift. On April 8, 2016, Keith Harward walked out of the Nottoway Correctional Center into a world he barely recognized. He was 60 years old. He wore glasses he didn't need anymore, clothes that didn't fit, and spoke about having to start his life over. Outside the gate, he inhaled real air. Not recycled cell air, not prison heat, not the scent of concrete. Real air. Fresh. Alive. Reporters gathered. Cameras clicked. Microphones pointed at him like weapons of truth. "What's the first thing you want to do?" a journalist asked. Harward said he was placing a priority on finding fried oysters to dine on. "Everything," he said with tears in his eyes. After 3 decades of lost birthdays, funerals he couldn't attend, relationships that faded, and a world that moved on without him, he finally had time again. When asked about being free, Harward later said, "Best part is being out with my family. Worst part is some of my families are not here." He'd been 26 years old when they locked him away. He was 60 when he came home. Harward had to learn how to use a smartphone, how to navigate a world of touchscreens and GPS, how to live without counting the minutes until the next head count. He said he'd do the things normal people hate to do: mow, rake leaves, and just simple stuff like working on the house and yard. Taking on these tasks gave him a sense of satisfaction and accomplishment that was taken from him when he was wrongfully incarcerated. But bit by bit, he fought his way back into the world. In 2017, Virginia Governor Terry McAuliffe signed House Bill 1650, awarding Harward compensation totaling approximately $1.55 million. He received an initial lump sum payment of over $309,000, with the remainder used to purchase an annuity structured in his best interests. He was also provided up to $10,000 for tuition for career and technical training. With his compensation, Harward bought a new car, a tractor, a mini bike, and even his own Prevost motorcoach bus that he named Tater Blue. Tater was his name back in prison. He has a partner, Mary Dodd, and the pair discussed taking a cross-country trip on his bus. In the aftermath, the experts who testified against him stood by their bite mark claims. They refused to admit they helped destroy an innocent life. But forensic science had already changed forever, largely because of cases like Keith Harward's. The National Academy of Sciences' groundbreaking 2009 report found no evidence of an existing scientific basis for identifying an individual through bite mark comparison to the exclusion of all others. In February 2016, the Texas Forensic Science Commission recommended that the state issue a moratorium on the use of bite mark analysis in prosecutions. Harward is at least the 25th person to have been wrongfully convicted or indicted based at least in part on bite mark evidence. Today, bite mark evidence is almost entirely discredited, abandoned by the same legal system that once treated it as infallible. And Keith? His story is featured in the Netflix docuseries, The Innocence Files, which examines cases of people wrongfully convicted based on bite mark evidence and exonerated with the help of the Innocence Project. He now travels across the country speaking about wrongful conviction and advocating against bite mark analysis. He said if there's a bite mark case trying to be admitted, he will show up and tell them no. He will stand out front with a placard and say this stuff is junk. Harward told the Innocence Project he has a unique life story, and by telling it he can maybe change the course of other innocent people's lives. He hopes people come away with a wow moment and ask, can this really happen in the United States of America? This is the story of a man who spent 33 years in a cage because someone claimed his teeth matched a bruise. The story of a system that refused to listen. The story of freedom stolen and freedom returned. The story of Keith Allen Harward, the sailor who lost half his life to a lie and survived to tell the world how easily it could happen again.